I never imagined that a simple weekend hike would turn into one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. I still remember the crisp autumn air and the crunch of dry leaves under my boots as I embarked on what I thought would be a refreshing escape into nature. I was drawn to the remote trails of the Appalachian woods, a place steeped in local lore and whispered ghost stories. I had always been fascinated by the idea of American ghost legends, but nothing had prepared me for what I was about to face. It started as any ordinary hike. The forest canopy painted patterns of light and shadow on the winding trail, and the familiar calls of distant birds filled the silence. I was alone, yet I felt a strange presence, as if I wasn't the only one wandering these ancient paths. A few hours into my trek, I came upon a clearing where an old, weathered sign pointed to a forgotten trail. Despite a prickling sensation in the back of my neck, I veered off the beaten path, hoping to uncover a hidden gem. As I followed the overgrown trail, the environment began to shift. The air turned colder, and the woods grew unnervingly silent. I could no longer hear the birds. Instead, an unsettling stillness enveloped me. It wasn't long before I encountered something that defied explanation. A dense, swirling mist that seemed to rise out of nowhere, obscuring my view. I remember halting in my tracks, my heart pounding as I strained to see through the murk. And then, in the periphery of my vision, I caught a glimpse of a pale figure drifting among the trees. I stopped dead in my tracks, feeling a chill run down my spine. The figure wasn't moving with purpose, but it emanated a sorrowful aura that made my skin crawl. I tried to convince myself that it was merely a trick of the light or my overactive imagination, but deep down I knew that something was terribly wrong. I continued walking, though every step felt heavier than the last, as if the forest itself was trying to hold me back. The further I ventured, the more the forest seemed to reveal its darker secrets. I heard whispers that were not carried by the wind, but seemed to echo from within the trees themselves. At one point, I sat on a fallen log to gather my thoughts, and I distinctly heard my name being softly called from the shadows. "Mark," the voice murmured, its tone both mournful and accusing. I froze, scanning the darkness for any sign of another hiker, but I was alone. Panic began to creep in, and I knew I had to leave this cursed part of the woods. My heart raced as I retraced my steps, but the forest did not let me leave easily. Every turn seemed to lead me deeper into the labyrinth of gnarled trees and tangled underbrush. In a moment of desperate clarity, I recalled a local legend about a spirit who wandered these woods, forever searching for lost souls. According to the story, the ghost was once a hiker who perished under mysterious circumstances, and now it lured unsuspecting wanderers to share its eternal fate. I tried to rationalize the tale as just another folktale, but the oppressive atmosphere and the eerie phenomena I had witnessed made it all too real. The mist thickened around me, and I could feel invisible eyes watching my every move. Shadows shifted unnaturally, and for a brief moment I thought I saw more figures joining the one I had first seen, each one a ghostly echo of a person long lost. Their faces were sorrowful and resigned, as if trapped in an endless loop of despair. I began to run, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches reaching out like skeletal hands impeding my progress. Every so often I would hear a soft cry or the faint sound of footsteps behind me. My instincts screamed that I was being pursued, yet when I turned, there was nothing but darkness and the relentless rustle of leaves. In the midst of my frantic escape, I stumbled upon an old abandoned ranger station. The building, though dilapidated, offered a glimmer of hope, a place to catch my breath and perhaps find a way out. As I pushed open the creaking door, a musty odor and the remnants of old maps and dusty records greeted me. I fumbled through the debris, searching for any indication of a trail or a landmark that could lead me back to safety. That's when I found a tattered journal, its pages yellowed with age. The entries were written in a hurried scrawl, detailing the experiences of a former park ranger who had encountered similar ghostly apparitions. The final entry was particularly chilling. It recounted the night a group of hikers had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only eerie echoes of their last moments. As I read, a sudden cold gust swept through the station, extinguishing the weak beam of my flashlight. In that pitch darkness, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible tapping at the door. as if someone or something was trying to get in. I couldn't tell if it was the sound of my own frenzied heartbeat or the footsteps of the unseen. I huddled in the corner, clutching the journal like a talisman, as the tapping grew louder and more insistent. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was so profound it felt as if the world had been erased. I forced myself to move, edging towards the door, and slowly opened it to see nothing but an empty, fog-shrouded forest. The decision was clear. I had to leave. With trembling hands and a mind teetering on the brink of madness, I stepped back into the cold night. The forest had transformed once more. The dense fog now seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and the ghostly figures appeared to drift in a mournful parade. I pushed on, fueled by a desperate need to escape the clutches of whatever haunted these woods. Every step was a struggle as the forest resisted my departure, but somehow I found my way back to the familiar path. The oppressive darkness slowly lifted, and the comforting sounds of nature returned. I emerged from the woods at dawn, battered and broken, with a story that few would believe. Even now, as I recount this tale, I can still hear the ghostly whispers and feel the lingering presence of the spirits that haunt those forgotten trails. I share my experience not to frighten, but to warn anyone who might venture into those haunted woods. The forest holds secrets that are best left undisturbed. That, and sometimes the call of the wild is a siren song leading you to an inescapable fate. I will never forget the terror of that night, the spectral figures that reached out from the mist, and the endless whisper of names long lost to time.
Next story.
I never imagined that the echoing corridors of an abandoned mining complex in the Nevada desert could harbor secrets so dark. My name is Laura, and this is my story. A story of a night that blurred the line between the living and the dead. I had come to investigate the ruins of the old Silver Strike mine, a place once bustling with hope and hard work, but now left to decay under the relentless gaze of the desert sun. Local legends spoke of strange lights in the tunnels and disembodied voices echoing in the vast emptiness. As a journalist with a taste for the paranormal, I couldn't resist the lure of uncovering the truth behind these eerie tales. The journey began on an unusually chilly evening. The desert, known for its scorching days, turned a biting cold after dusk, and a heavy fog had settled over the mining town of Silver Creek, a ghost town that had grown around the mine long after its closure. I had been warned by the few locals who still lived in the region, but their warnings only deepened my curiosity. With my camera and voice recorder in hand, I stepped into the mine's entrance, the rusted gates creaking as they swung open like a portal into another time. Inside, the mine was a labyrinth of dark, winding passages. The only light came from the beam of my flashlight, which danced over walls layered with decades of dust and rust. As I advanced deeper, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The oppressive silence was punctuated by the occasional drip of water from unseen fissures and the distant rumble of the shifting earth. After several hours of careful exploration, I reached what appeared to be the central hub of the mine, a large cavern with remnants of old mining equipment scattered about. It was there that I first sensed something was not right. The temperature plummeted, and the beam of my flashlight wavered as if disturbed by an unseen force. I paused to catch my breath, feeling an inexplicable dread creeping into my bones. Then I heard it, a faint, sorrowful melody, like the soft hum of a lullaby drifting through the darkness. It was impossible to tell if it was a trick of the wind or something more sinister. I followed the sound, drawn to a narrow passageway that led deeper underground. Every step felt heavier, as though the very air was thick with despair. The further I went, the clearer the melody became, resonating with a melancholy that was both beautiful and terrifying. In that narrow corridor, I stumbled upon an old, worn-out journal lying on a dusty crate. Its pages were filled with the frantic handwriting of a man who once worked in these very tunnels. The journal spoke of a tragic accident that occurred decades ago, a collapse that took the lives of several miners, including the author, who claimed that their spirits were trapped in the mine, bound by guilt and sorrow. The final entry described an apparition that would appear on moonless nights, its mournful song echoing through the shafts, a plea for release from its eternal torment. Before I could absorb the full horror of the words, The corridor's darkness seemed to pulse around me. I felt an icy hand brush against my shoulder, and I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. There, in the dim glow of my flashlight, stood a figure, a man in old-fashioned miner's attire, his face pale and eyes filled with an endless sadness. He did not speak, but his presence conveyed a message of deep regret and despair. Frozen by fear, yet compelled to understand, I took a hesitant step forward. The figure began to move slowly, gliding along the narrow passage as if beckoning me to follow. My logical mind screamed to run, but my feet were rooted in place, as if the spirit's sorrow had cast a spell over me. The ghost led me to a sealed-off section of the mine, where the walls were scarred by the violence of the collapse. Here, the air was thick with a palpable grief, and I could almost hear the echoes of lost voices. In the center of this hidden chamber was a rusted safety lamp, its glass face cracked and dusty. The spirit stopped beside it and, with a gesture so subtle it could have been imagined, indicated that I should look closer. As I approached, the lamp flickered to life on its own, bathing the chamber in an eerie, flickering glow. Shadows danced on the walls, and I could see images forming, phantom figures of miners working and laughing, and then suddenly, chaos erupted as the tunnel gave way. I realized then that I was witnessing the spectral replay of that fateful day, the moment of collapse etched into the mine's soul. The vision was overwhelming, a tapestry of despair and lost hope. I could hear the cries of the fallen, the clamor of desperate shouts, and the ominous creak of the collapsing earth. In that moment, the ghostly miner's face turned toward me, his eyes pleading for forgiveness, for understanding. It was as if he wanted to convey that tragedy was not just a moment in time, but a lingering wound that had festered into something dark and unyielding. Suddenly, the spectral images began to fade, and I was left alone with my pounding heart and a mind racing with questions. The ghost of the miner slowly receded into the shadows, leaving behind an unsettling silence that felt more oppressive than before. I knew then that I had witnessed something truly supernatural. A moment frozen in time where the past reached out to the present, desperately trying to make amends. With trembling hands, I gathered the journal and my equipment, retracing my steps through the labyrinthine corridors. The once foreboding mine now felt like an entity of its own, its walls whispering secrets that I was unprepared to hear. Every creak of the settling structure, every echo of my footsteps reminded me of the lives that had been lost and the sorrow that still lingered in these depths. I emerged from the mine just before dawn, the pale light of morning struggling to dispel the haunting images of the night before. The experience had left me shaken to my core, a stark reminder that some wounds never truly heal, and some spirits never find rest. In the days that followed, I spent countless hours researching the history of Silver Strike Mine, interviewing locals, and piecing together fragments of a tragic story that spanned generations. Even now, as I sit at my desk recounting this experience, I feel the weight of the miner's sorrow in my every breath. I have learned that the past is never truly dead. It lingers in the forgotten corners of our world, in the silence of abandoned places, and in the echoes of lost lives. The ghost of Silver Strike Mine remains with me, a spectral reminder that sometimes the dead walk among us, their stories unfinished, their voices still crying out for redemption. I share this tale not as a work of fiction, but as a truth I have lived. It is a warning to those who dare to disturb the resting places of history, to those who seek to unearth secrets best left buried. For in the heart of the desert, beneath the scorching sun and the cool night air, there lie stories that are darker than the deepest shadows, stories of sorrow and despair that echo through time.
Next story.
I've been hiking in these woods my whole life, but I never expected anything like what happened to me last fall. It started out like any other solo trip I'd taken before, just a chance to get away from the hustle of everyday life and reconnect with nature. I wanted some peace and quiet away from my phone and the constant buzz of the world around me, but what I got was far from peaceful. It was a cool October morning, crisp but not too cold. The sun was barely up, casting a golden light through the treetops as I began my hike. I'd done this trail 100 times, and I knew every turn, every rock, every little stream. But there's something about hiking alone that changes the feeling of even the most familiar places. It's quiet out there, too quiet, and every snap of a twig, Every rustle of leaves makes you wonder if something's out there with you. But I wasn't worried. I was used to it, or at least I thought I was. I remember the first time I felt something was off. It was around noon, and I'd reached a part of the trail where the trees were dense, the kind of thick forest where the sunlight barely touches the ground. The air was damp, and the smell of earth was heavy in my lungs. The woods felt different that day. Maybe it was just the time of year, or maybe it was my imagination, but something about the way the wind whispered through the trees made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stopped for a moment, trying to shake the unease that was creeping up on me. I pulled out my map and checked my route, making sure I was still on track. That's when I noticed something strange. There were no animal sounds. Usually the woods are alive with birds chirping, squirrels running through the underbrush, but it was deathly quiet. I looked around, half expecting to see some wild animals staring at me from between the trees, but nothing. Just the oppressive silence and the rustling leaves. At that point, I decided to press on. I mean, what else could I do? The trail wasn't going to hike itself, but it felt like the woods were closing in on me, the trees leaning in a little too close, the shadows darker than usual. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the creeping feeling. I couldn't afford to let my mind get the best of me. But as the day wore on, the eerie feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. The trail started to twist and wind in ways I didn't remember. It wasn't that I'd gotten lost. No, I was sure of where I was, but it felt like the woods were shifting, like I was walking through a maze I'd never seen before. The path I had known for years was no longer familiar. I stopped at a clearing to rest, sitting on a rock near a small creek. The sound of running water was soothing, almost calming. I thought about heading back, but I wanted to reach the peak before sunset, so I decided to push forward. That's when I heard it. It started as a faint sound in the distance, almost like the wind, but it didn't feel like the wind. It sounded like voices, distant and soft, but there was something wrong about them. It was as if they were being carried by the wind, but not in the way voices should be. There was no clear direction. 1 minute, I could hear them behind me, and the next, they seemed to come from the trees on my left. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone. I knew it. I got up, feeling the first real pang of fear, and glanced around. There was nothing. The trees, the rocks, the creek, they were all just as they had been before. But I could still hear those voices, muffled, distorted. They weren't words, just low murmurs, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but my feet wouldn't stop moving. I needed to get out of there. I started walking faster, hoping to get to the clearing up ahead, but the voices followed me. They were louder now, closer. It was as if they were moving with me, matching my pace. Panic began to rise in my chest. I tried to tell myself that it was just the wind or my imagination, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. I turned a corner and almost stumbled into an old cabin. I hadn't seen it before. I didn't even know there was a cabin out here. It was small, dilapidated, and seemed completely out of place. The roof had caved in and the walls were covered in thick layers of moss and vines. I wasn't sure why, but I felt drawn to it. It was like the cabin was calling me, and I couldn't stop myself from walking toward it. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature dropped. It was like the warmth of the sun had been swallowed up by the cabin. The air was thick, musty, and smelled of rot. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I moved deeper into the darkened interior. There was nothing inside, no furniture, no signs of life, just dust and debris. But then I saw it. At the far end of the cabin, barely visible in the shadows, was an old wooden chair. It was positioned directly under a broken window, the sun's dying light casting long shadows across the floor. In the seat of the chair was a figure. I froze. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't breathe. The figure was hunched over, its back to me. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it was there. The whispers grew louder now, coming from all directions. The figure slowly turned its head toward me, and for a split second, I thought I saw its eyes. Black, empty holes. Nothing but darkness. I ran. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't care if I was headed in the right direction. I just ran, pushing through the thick brush, tripping over rocks, and barely avoiding tree branches that slapped at my face. I don't know how long I ran, but I didn't stop until I finally broke free of the woods and stumbled onto the trailhead. I don't remember much after that. I know I made it back to my car somehow. I remember the sound of my keys jangling in my hands, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from that place. But the whispers, they followed me. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me. I kept hearing those voices, even when I was at home, even when I was surrounded by people. And sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I'd catch a glimpse of something moving, just out of sight. But when I turned to look, there was nothing. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't ever plan to.
Next story.
It happened in a small town called Maplewood, tucked away between the hills and forests of rural New England. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing unusual ever really happens. But something strange happened one evening, something that no one in Maplewood will ever forget. It all started with an old abandoned house at the end of Maple Street. That house had been standing there for decades, falling apart piece by piece. People said it was cursed, and the locals avoided it like the plague. There were stories, of course, rumors about the previous owners, a family that had lived there long ago. They had disappeared mysteriously one night, never to be heard from again. After that, the house stood empty, its windows boarded up and the yard overgrown with weeds. No one dared to go near it. But there was a group of friends, Mike, Sarah, Jack, and Olivia, who had always been curious about that house. They'd grown up hearing the stories, the legends, the warnings, and one evening, after a few drinks by the bonfire at Jack's place, they decided it was time to explore the house. "Come on, it's just a house," Mike said, laughing as he tossed another log on the fire. "All these stories are just old people gossiping. We'll be fine." "We should have done this a long time ago," Olivia added, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "What's the worst that could happen?" Jack and Sarah exchanged uneasy glances but didn't say anything. The truth was they were all scared, but they didn't want to back down now. They'd made up their minds. The house wasn't far from the bonfire, just a short walk through the woods behind Jack's place. The trees loomed tall and thick, casting long shadows across the trail. As they walked, the air grew heavier. The sounds of the forest around them seemed to disappear, and all they could hear was the crunch of leaves underfoot. When they reached the house, they stood there for a moment, staring up at it. The building was even worse up close. The shutters were crooked and the roof sagged under the weight of time. The front door was ajar, creaking in the wind. "This is it," Jack said, his voice sounding almost nervous. "Let's just get this over with." They pushed open the door, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the house was even worse. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. There were shattered windows, broken furniture scattered across the rooms, and the floorboards creaked ominously under their weight. But what really struck them was the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnatural, like the house was holding its breath. "Let's split up and see what we can find," Sarah suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll meet back here in 30 minutes. Reluctantly, they agreed. Mike and Olivia headed toward the living room, while Jack and Sarah ventured upstairs. The old house seemed to shift and groan with every step they took, and the further they went, the more uneasy they became. It didn't take long for them to feel the first signs that something was wrong. Mike was the first to hear it. A soft whisper, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. It came from the far corner of the room, behind a broken chair. He turned around, his heart racing. There was nothing there, just the remains of old furniture and cobwebs. But the whispering continued, growing louder and more distinct. He could make out the words now, though they sent a chill down his spine. "Get out!" Mike froze, his blood running cold. "Olivia?" he called out, his voice shaking. There was no response. The house was still. The whisper came again, clearer now. "Get out!" Panicked, Mike turned and ran, but when he reached the door, it wouldn't open. His hand twisted the knob frantically, but it was stuck. He looked back toward the darkness of the living room, and there in the corner he saw something. No, someone, standing in the shadows. It was a figure, tall and thin, its face obscured by a hood, but Mike could feel its eyes on him, piercing through the dark. "Olivia!" he screamed, pounding on the door. Still, there was no answer. Back upstairs, Sarah and Jack were having their own terrifying experience. As they moved deeper into the house, they found an old, dusty bedroom. The wallpaper was peeling, and the bed was covered in a layer of dust. But in the center of the room, there was an old rocking chair. It began to rock back and forth on its own, slowly at first, then picking up speed. Jack stepped forward, his voice trembling. Did you see that? Before Sarah could respond, the room grew cold. The air turned thick, and she felt a sudden weight pressing down on her chest. The whispers began again, coming from every direction, but now they were louder, more desperate. Leave. Leave now. Then the chair stopped rocking. Sarah and Jack turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was an old woman, her face pale and twisted, her eyes hollow and wide, as though she hadn't slept in years. The room seemed to pulse with an oppressive energy, and the woman's lips moved in a silent, twisted motion. Get out, she hissed, her voice like dry leaves rustling. Suddenly, everything went dark. The shadows in the room seemed to swallow the light, and for a moment they couldn't see anything. The temperature dropped, and they could feel a cold breath on the back of their necks. They tried to scream, but their voices wouldn't come. They ran, stumbling down the stairs, crashing into walls, until they finally reached the front door. The door opened with a loud creak, and they burst out into the yard, gasping for air. They didn't stop running until they reached Jack's house, where they collapsed in a heap, too terrified to speak. When the sun came up, they went back to the house, hoping it was all just a bad dream. But the house was still there, standing in the same decrepit state it had been before. They couldn't bring themselves to go inside again, but when they peered through the broken windows, they swore they saw shadows moving inside. And for days after, each one of them would hear the whispers, soft and distant, telling them the same thing: get out. The house is still there, standing at the end of Maple Street, its windows dark and its door ajar, and no one dares to go near it anymore.
Next story.
I never thought I'd find myself recounting something as surreal as what happened to me in the depths of those ancient American woods. It's been years, but the terror, the uncertainty that night still clings to my every memory, whispering to me at the most unguarded moments. I remember the day I set out with a group of friends on what we assumed was a routine hike. The air was brisk, the promise of adventure clear in the sparkling sunlight that filtered through the tall pines. But I was already attuned to an inexplicable, restless energy in the forest, a feeling that something was watching us. We began our trek on a well-worn trail, familiar to local hikers, but my gut told me that we were venturing into territory rarely tread after dusk. The deeper we moved into the forest, the thicker the canopy became, swallowing the light and turning the path into something almost unrecognizable. I tried to shake off the creeping sense of dread, convinced it was just excitement mingled with nervousness. That night, my intuition would prove to be a crucial warning I had chosen to ignore. As dusk gave way to darkness, our laughter and chatter slowly dwindled under the oppressive silence that blanketed the woods. I found myself straying further from the group as I paused to take in the eerie serenity of the night. In that moment, I recognized I was alone. My heart pounded with every step I took, the crunch of dead leaves and snapping twigs echoing in the stillness. I remembered old ghost stories, dismissing them as mere folklore, until I heard a rustling behind me that didn't match the natural sounds of the forest. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath shallow. "Hello?" I called out, voice trembling, but there was no answer, only the sound of my rapid heartbeat and the wind whistling through the trees. I turned around slowly and saw, or thought I saw, a shadow flitting between the trees. It wasn't the shape of any animal I'd ever encountered. It moved with a shuddering, jerky motion that defied the natural sway of the forest around me. Panicked, I hastened back to the trail, the sensation of being followed intensifying with every step. At a certain point, I tripped on a concealed root and fell hard onto the forest floor. In that split second, I looked up to see a pale face, almost translucent against the darkness, hovering just inches from mine. Its eyes were large and haunted, filled with sorrow and despair. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure reached out with a gnarled hand, and I felt an icy grip brush against my skin. Frozen in terror, I could only stare as the ghostly apparition slowly receded back into the darkness, leaving me trembling and disoriented. I scrambled to my feet and resumed my run, desperately trying to find the main trail. The path twisted unexpectedly, and soon I was lost in an unfamiliar section of the woods. Every branch, every rustle seemed to echo the ghost's silent lament. I noticed peculiar symbols etched into the bark of a massive oak, a series of patterns that looked both ancient and anguished. In that moment, I recalled local legends about cursed groves, where the spirits of those who died under mysterious circumstances were doomed to linger. I didn't know what to believe, but fear had a way of making reality as fragile as a whisper. While I stumbled through the undergrowth, I thought I heard soft singing carried by the wind, a melancholy tune that seemed to float between the trees, both soothing and sinister. I couldn't tell if it was a human voice or an echo of some spectral lament. The song guided me, as though offering a promise of safety or perhaps leading me deeper into the unknown. I followed it, clinging to the hope that any sound was better than the eerie silence that pursued me relentlessly. But as I drew closer, I realized that the melody was not meant for comfort. It sounded almost mournful, as if the singer was trapped in an eternal curse. At some point, I found myself in a clearing illuminated by a ghostly light. There, standing among a circle of ancient stones, was a figure shrouded in a long, tattered garment. The figure beckoned me closer, and though every instinct screamed to run, I felt compelled to approach. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely audible. The figure's response was a mere whisper that blended with the night air. "I am the keeper of the lost. I wander these woods, forever cursed to watch over those who stray." The words sent a shudder down my spine, and for a moment, I felt a kinship with the lost souls of the forest. I dared to ask, "What do you want from me?" In reply, the specter extended an arm, revealing a series of intricate scars along its hand, each one a silent testimony to untold stories of anguish and despair. Without warning, the ghost reached towards my chest, and I felt a coldness seeping into my body, a sensation that went far beyond the chill of the evening. Time seemed to stretch into eternity as I realized the spirit was not merely touching me, but transferring a profound sorrow and an ancient grief that threatened to overwhelm my senses. Memories flashed before my eyes, scenes of tumultuous battles, unfulfilled promises, and lives cut tragically short, all woven together in the fabric of the forest's haunted history. I struggled to break free, but the force was relentless, pulling me deeper into a state of despair I hadn't thought possible. My will eventually snapped, and as quickly as it had come, the pressure subsided. The ghost retreated into the darkness, leaving me alone in the clearing with nothing but my own ragged breathing for company. Shaking, I turned away and began the long journey back to the main trail, every step heavy with the burden of what I had experienced. The forest, now imbued with a sorrowful energy, seemed to watch me, its every branch and shadow echoing the silent grief of the restless dead. Hours later, I finally stumbled back to the trail, my friends' voices faint in the distance. Their relief upon seeing me was palpable, yet I could see a flicker of dread in their eyes as I recounted what had happened. I left them that night, unable to share the entirety of the horror I had witnessed. I kept that secret locked away, knowing that some truths are too heavy for daylight. Even now, years later, the memories come unbidden. The spectral figure, the cold touch of ancient sorrow, and the mournful melody that lingers in the dead of night. I still question what cursed secret that forest hides, and whether I was chosen by fate to inherit a burden that will never lift. To anyone listening to my story, I leave a warning. The woods are not merely a collection of trees and winding paths. They are a living, breathing entity, a keeper of secrets and guardian of lost souls. Every step you take in those ancient groves may lead to an encounter with a spirit whose purpose is as tragic as it is relentless. If you value your sanity, then tread lightly, for some ghosts in these woods are not meant to be disturbed, and their sorrow runs as deep as the roots of the oldest trees.
Next story.
I never imagined that a routine overnight stay in a forgotten roadside motel would turn into one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. It was during a long drive through the barren stretches of Nevada when my old car sputtered to a halt outside a fading sign that read, "Edison's Lodge since 1923. I pulled over, hoping for a quick fix and a safe place to sleep. Instead, I encountered a truth I can scarcely believe. A presence from another time that still lingers in those lonely halls. I remember arriving at dusk, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple, as I parked my car under a flickering neon sign. The motel had an air of neglect about it. The paint was peeling from the wooden siding, The windows were dusty, and the overgrown brush all around whispered secrets of forgotten days. Inside the lobby, a chill greeted me that no desert breeze could match. There was no one at the front desk, only a ledger left open on a counter, as though waiting for someone to sign in. My first thought was that I had reached a relic of the past, an abandoned project left to the mercy of time. But I paid no mind as exhaustion clouded my judgment. I checked in, leaving my car keys in the lockbox and accepting the rusted key to room 7. The hallway was narrow, dimly lit by swinging fluorescent lights that buzzed intermittently. As I climbed the creaking stairs, each step echoed like a heartbeat in the silent building. When I finally reached my room, I was struck by its dated decor, a faded floral wallpaper, a heavy wooden dresser, and an antique mirror that dominated one wall. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched as I closed the door behind me. That night, sleep eluded me. Around midnight, I awoke to the sound of soft humming coming from the corridor. At first, I assumed it was my imagination, or perhaps the wind rustling through the broken windows. But the sound grew persistent, accompanied by a gentle tapping at the door. I mustered my courage and inched toward the peephole. Outside, in the dim corridor light, I saw nothing but the empty hall. Nevertheless, the humming continued, closer now, as if the tune had crossed the threshold of my room. Unable to quell my unease, I opened the door. In the hallway, the air seemed charged with a coldness that contrasted sharply with the desert night outside. I noticed footprints in the dust, small, tentative tracks that led down the hall. They were too delicate to be from an adult, yet too deliberate to be from a child lost in a motel. As I followed them with hesitant steps, I recalled local urban legends about Edison's Lodge, stories told by old-timers around campfires. They spoke of a little girl named Clara who once lived at the motel in the 1930s, a vibrant child whose life ended mysteriously one stormy night. According to lore, her spirit never left the place, roaming the halls in search of a lost comfort. My heart raced as I reached the staircase landing. There, I caught a glimpse of movement, a small, pale figure disappearing around the corner of the hall. I called out softly, "Clara?" even though I wasn't sure if it was real or if my imagination was playing tricks on me. The silence that followed was deafening, but then the humming resumed, distant and sorrowful, as if echoing a long-forgotten lullaby. Drawn by an inexplicable compulsion, I followed the sound through the maze of hallways. My flashlight beam danced across walls adorned with faded photographs of smiling families and vacationers from decades past. One particular picture, a little girl in a white dress, almost made my blood run cold, as it bore an uncanny resemblance to the figure I had seen. In that moment, the air grew heavier, the hum turning into a mournful sigh that seemed to seep into my very soul. The sound led me to a small parlor at the end of a narrow passage, a room that shouldn't have existed according to the motel's layout. The room was ornate, with velvet drapes and a chandelier that, despite its tarnish, still shimmered ominously in the low light. In the center, a grand mirror sat upon a pedestal, the surface clouded by age and the weight of countless secrets. As I stepped closer, I saw a reflection that wasn't mine, a little girl standing behind me, her eyes wide with pain and longing. I spun around, but the room was empty. The mirror, however, told a different story. Clara's ghostly figure, framed in the past, reached out with a hand that seemed to plead silently. My throat tightened as I felt a sudden, inexplicable sorrow, an almost physical yearning for something lost. The little girl's eyes held a message of despair and a need for help, a silent cry that echoed through the decades. I struggled to speak, and the only word that escaped was a whisper of, "What do you need?" The mirror shimmered, and for a fleeting moment, I was transported back to that stormy night of the past. I saw a glimpse of a frantic woman, drenched and desperate, desperately clutching a small child near a blazing fireplace. In that ghostly vision, time and memory intermingled. Clara's mother, whose heart had shattered when the roof gave way during a fierce storm, trapping the innocent child in the burning rubble. The tragic event had left an indelible mark on the motel's soul, and somehow, Clara's spirit became forever intertwined with the walls of Edison's Lodge. Overwhelmed by the intensity of the vision, I fell to my knees. The mirror's surface rippled and faded, and the sorrowful humming receded into a soft whisper of gratitude. I realized that in witnessing Clara's anguish, I had become an unwitting confidant, a bearer of her unspeakable burden. The parlor door creaked open, and the spectral figure of a woman in period clothing appeared, a distraught maternal presence who offered a silent nod, acknowledging the pain she had once suffered. The encounter left me shaken, but strangely compelled to help. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of duty to honor Clara's story. I reached out to local historians and the descendants of the motel's original owners, piecing together accounts of that fateful night. I learned that in 1935, a violent thunderstorm had erupted and a bolt of lightning struck the motel, igniting a fire that claimed the lives of several guests. Among the casualties was young Clara, whose tiny form was never found in the ashes. The tragedy, obscured by the passage of time, had become another ghost story, a cautionary tale of loss and the lingering effects of unspeakable grief. Determined to bring Clara's story to light and to offer closure, I embarked on a mission to restore a part of the motel that had remained untouched since those terrible events. I arranged for a small memorial to be placed near the old parlor, a simple plaque bearing Clara's name and a brief account of the tragedy. In the quiet hours of one autumn evening, as I stood by the memorial under the silent gaze of the stars, I sensed a gentle breeze and the soft echo of a lullaby carried on the wind. It was as though Clara had finally found solace in the acknowledgement of her pain. Though Edison's Lodge has long been abandoned and reclaimed by the harsh Nevada desert, I still feel that my encounter with Clara and the sorrowful mother who watched over her is not merely a figment of imagination. It is a raw, undeniable piece of our history, a reminder of the fragile line between our world and the past. Whenever I pass by that lonely stretch of highway, I remember the eyes of a little girl filled with longing and the quiet promise that sometimes even the most tragic stories deserve to be heard.
Next story.
I still remember the night I first set foot in a place no one in town dared speak of, a long-forgotten carnival on the edge of a derelict ghost town. I was returning home after a long day at work when I took a detour along a winding back road, lured by a flicker of neon lights in the distance. They pulsed rhythmically like a dying heartbeat, a stark contrast to the absolute stillness of the surrounding desert. By the time I reached what remained of the old Brighton Carnival, dusk had surrendered to a starless night, and a palpable shiver clutched at me as I stepped through the rusted iron gates. There was an eerie silence among the broken-down attractions, the silent remnants of a time when laughter and music filled the air. The once vibrant tents lay deflated and tattered, their colors faded like a memory. I entered the grounds cautiously, my flashlight slicing through the oppressive darkness and illuminating pieces of forgotten history. Discarded ticket stubs, broken rides, and an old callboard whose peeling letters read "Laugh and Cry in Time." The air was heavy with a scent of dampness and decay, as if the carnival was exhaling sorrow from every pore. I wandered slowly along the cracked concrete, each step echoing in the vast emptiness. As I passed the shattered facade of the funhouse, I heard an odd sound, like the distant jingle of a music box tinkling in a minor key. I paused, heart pounding, and listened intently. It grew louder, drawing me toward the center of the attraction. The sound was hypnotic, its cadence both inviting and sinister. It was as if the carnival itself was summoning me deeper into its haunted heart. Drawn by an inexplicable compulsion, I followed the delicate chime to the main circus tent, a gigantic structure that still clung to a semblance of its former glory. The tent's faded red and white stripes billowed slightly in an inexplicable breeze, though the night was unusually still. As I stepped inside, my flashlight beam revealed rows of empty, rotting seats and a stage draped in shadows. The music had slowed to a dirge-like melody, and then I saw it. A solitary figure standing in the middle of the stage. The figure was clad in a battered clown costume, the fabric once bright, now dulled with grime and age. The clown's face was a grotesque mask of sorrow, painted with a smile that seemed too wide and too permanent to be real. His eyes, dark hollows without glints of mischief or malice, fixed directly on me, as though he had been waiting for my arrival. I couldn't tell if it was his eyes that held me captive, or the overwhelming aura of despair emanating from him. His voice, when he spoke, was a cracked whisper that shivered through the silence. "You have come to remember." The words echoed in a way that made it seem as if the entire building was mourning. "I am Jasper," he continued, introducing himself with an unnatural calm that belied the horror of his presence. "I was once the heart of this carnival, the one who brought joy, but I have been forgotten, left behind with my sorrows." I felt my mouth go dry as I tried to comprehend his words. How could a ghost of a clown plead for remembrance? He stepped closer, and I noticed the remnants of what must have once been elaborate makeup smeared across his cheeks, now hardened in grotesque patterns of grief. "I was the star of my show, a beacon of laughter in a world of darkness. But tragedy struck on one fateful night," he murmured, his voice resonating with a mix of regret and longing. "A fire consumed the tent while the show was in full swing. I watched my friends, my audience, all vanish into flames. In that agony, I was never laid to rest." I shuddered as his confession turned the air colder. The spectral figure moved slowly, almost ritualistically, beckoning me to follow him off the stage. Reluctantly, I trailed after him through a series of narrow corridors formed by collapsed tarps and piles of debris. Each step I took resonated with echoes of the past, and with every word Jasper spoke, I felt as though I was being pulled into his eternal sorrow. "You see," he whispered as we reached the heart of the deserted midway where the attractions now stood as silent, distorted memories. "This carnival was more than just a place of merriment. It was a sanctuary for lost souls seeking refuge in laughter during life's darkest hours. And now I wander here, cursed to replay the last moments of that ill-fated night over and over, seeking solace in the echoes of applause that have long since faded." As I absorbed his confession, I noticed the faint glow of an old carousel in the distance, its paint chipped and horses frozen mid-gallop. The carousel's tune, warped and eerie, merged with the sounds of my heavy breathing and Jasper's soft lament. In that surreal moment, I felt a deep sorrow welling up inside me, as if I had been entrusted with the last fragments of a shattered dream. Jasper stopped before a dilapidated ticket booth, its glass shattered and the letters barely legible. He turned to me, his eyes pleading, "You must help me remember. Tell the tale of tonight, so that our laughter may live on once more. Without remembrance, we fade into silence, into oblivion." His voice trembled with an urgency that startled me, and I realized that he was not asking for pity. He was asking for recognition, for an acknowledgement of the horror and the beauty that had once been his life. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak, as his spectral hand reached out and brushed my cheek with a touch as cold as midnight frost. The sensation was both horrifying and tender, a final caress from someone trapped in a limbo of eternal regret. "I promise," I managed to whisper, my voice echoing with both fear and resolve. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, Jasper began to fade, his form disintegrating into motes of light that danced around me. The carnival fell silent once more, the haunting melody of the carousel lingering in the background like a bittersweet requiem. I stood alone in that ghostly tableau, the air heavy with mourning and memories. I realized that I had been chosen as the keeper of Jasper's tale, a witness to the tragedy of a time when laughter was both a refuge and a requiem. I left the carnival that night with a promise to share its story, to let the world remember a life defined by both joy and sorrow. I often return, compelled by a need to honor the echo of Jasper's laughter, ensuring that the forgotten are never truly lost to the passage of time. The carnival stands as a monument to both the fleeting nature of happiness and the enduring power of memory, a reminder that even in our darkest hours, the ghosts of our past continue to whisper, urging us to remember.
Next story.
It was the summer of 1987 when Karen and her younger brother Max moved into the old farmhouse at the edge of town. The house had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades, and the locals had always whispered about its dark past. The house was large, with a sagging roof and overgrown vines curling around the porch. But Karen didn't care about the rumors. She was just happy to get away from the city and start fresh in a place where they could put down roots. Karen had been looking for a new beginning ever since their parents passed away the year before, and the farmhouse seemed like a perfect escape. Max, who was only 9, was more excited than anyone. The idea of exploring the woods around the house and running wild in the wide open fields was a dream come true for him. From the moment they moved in, Karen felt a strange pull toward the house. It was as if something about it was calling her. She tried to shake it off, thinking it was just the stress of the move, but the sensation never really left. And Max was acting strange too. At first, it was small things, talking to himself, asking questions about people Karen didn't know, or mentioning things that didn't make sense. But then, it got worse. It started on the first night. Max had been playing outside when Karen called him in for dinner. He didn't respond. She walked out onto the porch and saw him standing in the yard, staring up at the house with wide, unblinking eyes. She called his name again, but he didn't move. He was almost frozen. "Max, what are you doing?" Max turned slowly, his face pale, and said, "She's in there, Karen. She told me to come. She's waiting for me." Karen's stomach dropped. She assumed he was just being a kid, making up stories, but there was something in his voice that sent a chill down her spine. She took his hand and gently pulled him inside, locking the door behind them. "That's enough, Max. No more games." But Max was insistent. "She said she's not angry. She just wants me to visit." Karen tried to dismiss it, but that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The house was quiet, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It was oppressive. Every creak of the old floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows made her jump. The next few days passed uneventfully, but strange things started to happen. Max would disappear for hours at a time, wandering the grounds without saying a word to Karen. And when he did return, he would talk about her as though he'd been with someone, a woman he called the lady in the house. He described her in detail, a tall, thin woman with long, dark hair dressed in a faded black dress. But when Karen asked more questions, Max would grow silent and refuse to say another word about it. Then, one evening, Karen decided to check the attic. She hadn't had the chance to go up there yet, and with Max acting more and more distant, she wanted to make sure there was nothing dangerous in the house that could be affecting him. The attic was dark and dusty, filled with old boxes, furniture, and cobwebs. But something caught her eye. There was an old, ornate mirror against the far wall, its glass cracked and framed in dark wood. She approached it slowly, her heart beating faster with each step. As she reached out to touch the mirror, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. She could see her own reflection staring back at her, but something wasn't right. The reflection seemed off. She blinked and looked again, but it was still there. The image of a woman standing just behind her, a pale figure in a black dress, her face blurred but her eyes. Karen could see her eyes. Before she could react, a voice low and cold whispered from behind her, "She's mine." Karen spun around, but there was no one there. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow. She rushed down the stairs, her mind racing. She had to get Max. She had to get out of that house. When she reached the living room, she found him sitting by the window, staring out into the night. His face was blank, but his eyes were distant, unfocused. "Max," Karen said, her voice trembling. "What did you see? Who was she?" Max turned to her slowly, his eyes empty. "She wants me to stay. She doesn't want me to leave." "No, Max," Karen said firmly, kneeling in front of him. "We're leaving. We're leaving this house." But Max shook his head, his lips curling into a strange, unholy smile. "It's too late, Karen. She won't let us go." A loud bang sounded from the attic, followed by a series of thuds like something or someone was moving around up there. The air in the room thickened, and Karen felt the temperature drop sharply. Something was wrong. She had to get Max out of there. As she tried to pull him toward the door, the house seemed to shift. The walls groaned and the lights flickered. The windows rattled, as if the house itself was alive, pushing back against her. The air became thick with the smell of decay, and an overwhelming sense of dread flooded her chest. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Max stood motionless in front of it, staring at the reflection in the window. "Karen," he whispered, his voice low and flat, "she's here." Karen backed away, panic surging through her. The whispers came again, louder this time, echoing from every corner of the house. She turned, desperate to find an escape, but the house had become a maze. Each hallway led to another, each door was locked, and the shadows seemed to grow, closing in on her. Then she saw her. The woman from the mirror, standing at the end of the hall, her pale face now clear, her eyes dark, empty sockets. She moved slowly toward Karen, her feet gliding across the floor like she was floating. "Leave, or he stays," the woman whispered. Karen's blood ran cold. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing. She had to get Max out of there, no matter the cost. With every ounce of strength she had left, Karen lunged for the door, flinging it open. She grabbed Max's hand and pulled him into the yard, running until the house was out of sight. She didn't stop running until they reached the town and found someone to call for help. They never went back to the farmhouse, and it was eventually sold. But every year, on the anniversary of the night they fled, Karen can still hear the whispers when the wind blows through the trees. Leave, or he stays.
Next story.
I've never been one to believe in ghost stories until that fateful night at Silver Creek Terminal, a forgotten train station nestled on the outskirts of a once thriving small town in the Midwest. It was the kind of night when a suffocating fog smothered the landscape, and the hum of civilization was replaced by the distant rustling of dead leaves and a lonely wind that whispered of times past. I had been on my way home after a business trip when an unexpected train delay forced me to take shelter in this abandoned station, and what I encountered would forever alter my understanding of reality. When I first arrived, the terminal looked like a relic from another era. The building's once bright signage was now faded and barely legible beneath a layer of grime, and the cracked pavement was overrun with weeds. The clock above the entrance, its hands stuck at 11:47, added an eerie finality to the scene. Inside, the reception area was dimly lit by a few flickering fluorescent bulbs that cast long, dancing shadows across peeling wallpaper and dusty benches. I could almost feel the sorrow of forgotten goodbyes and missed arrivals seeping from every corner. I settled onto a creaky bench near the ticket counter, wrapping my arms around myself against the chill. The silence was overwhelming, the kind that presses in on you, as if the very walls were listening. At first, I convinced myself that my racing thoughts were simply a product of loneliness and fatigue from the long journey. But as minutes stretched into an uncomfortable hour, subtle disturbances began to break the silence. A soft murmur, like the distant murmur of disembarking passengers from a long-gone train, drifted through the air. I nearly dismissed it as the wind, but then I heard footsteps echoing in the empty corridor beyond the reception area. My heart began to pound as I strained to catch a glimpse of movement in the gloom. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow slip past an old service door, the figure too tall and deliberate to be imagined by my tired mind. Unable to ignore the unnerving sounds, I rose cautiously and followed the corridor. The hallways were narrow and lined with old lockers and bulletin boards containing yellowed notices of past departures. The atmosphere was thick with the residue of bygone eras. The scent of tobacco smoke, the faint aroma of espresso from a long-closed cafe, and something else, something metallic and indistinguishable, that made my skin prickle. Turning a corner near what once might have been a waiting lounge, I found myself face to face with a man in an old-fashioned station uniform. His posture was impeccable, his hat tilted just so, and his eyes bore a steady, unblinking gaze. The uniform, though dusty and frayed along the edges, was unmistakable, a relic of the mid-20th century. He offered no greeting. Instead, he simply regarded me as if he had been expecting my arrival. "Who are you?" I finally managed, my voice sounding small and insignificant in the vast, empty space. The figure inclined his head ever so slightly. In a deep, measured tone that resonated with an air of melancholy, he replied, "I am Marshall, the keeper of this place." His voice carried an otherworldly quality, reverberating off the walls as if echoing from a distant past. My pulse quickened as I listened. Marshall explained that he had served at Silver Creek Terminal for decades, before the station fell silent after a tragic accident that had sealed its fate. One stormy evening, a commuter train plunged off its tracks at a nearby crossing, and in that calamity, many lives were lost. Marshall, whose duty had been to ensure the safety of every soul that passed through his care, had perished in the ensuing chaos. "Now I linger here," he said softly, bound by regret and the duty of remembrance. His calm explanation contrasted starkly with the terror that churned inside me. I could hardly believe my ears. As if reading my thoughts, he continued, "You are not here by chance, and perhaps it is time the world remembered what happened." His gaze bore into mine, and I felt an inexplicable weight settle upon my shoulders, a burden of collective memory that spanned decades of sorrow and loss. Before I could ask another question, a series of disembodied sounds echoed from the far end of the station, a chilling blend of an old public address system crackling to life and murmured voices as if a long-forgotten announcement were being broadcasted. The sound was both eerie and sorrowful, reminiscent of the voices of passengers bidding farewell or crying out in panic as they fled the disaster. I turned to see flickering images in the dusty mirrors mounted along the walls. In them, I caught fleeting glimpses of people dressed in outdated attire, men in hats and women in long skirts, their expressions etched with fear and despair. It was as if the station itself were haunted by the souls of those lost in that fateful accident. Marshall raised a hand, inviting me to follow him deeper into the station. Reluctantly, I trailed him toward a narrow passage that led to what once must have been the waiting lounge. The air grew perceptibly colder, and the murmur of voices became a low dirge resonating with an unbearable sadness. At the far end of the room, illuminated by a solitary beam of moonlight breaking through a cracked window, lay a battered bench with a small plaque dedicated to the victims of the train crash. I knelt down and read the names scrawled in faded ink, a roster of lives that had been abruptly ended, now bound to the station for eternity. The spectral figure of Marshall stood silently by my side, his eyes reflecting both regret and a plea for remembrance. "Remember them," he whispered. "They are not forgotten." In that moment, I felt a surge of emotion, a deep sadness that seemed to flow from the very walls around me, mingling with my own grief for a loss I had never personally endured but now felt deeply connected to. For what felt like hours, I sat there, absorbed by the spectral whispers and the solemn presence of Marshall. I began to understand that Silver Creek Terminal was not merely a derelict building, but a sanctuary for memories, a holding place for souls unable to move on. The station's ghostly inhabitants, including Marshall, were tied to this place by duty and love, a tragic commitment to ensure that the past would not be erased from the annals of time. As the first light of dawn crept hesitantly through the broken windows, Marshall's form began to fade. With a final, lingering look that brimmed with profound sadness, he murmured, "Your presence here has rekindled what was almost lost. Carry our story so we may finally find peace." I reached out, desperate to hold on to him, but his figure dissolved into a swirl of dust and memories, leaving me alone in that cold, empty space. I left Silver Creek Terminal that morning with a heavy heart and a promise to honor the legacy of those who had lost their lives in that forgotten tragedy. Since that night, I've made it my mission to share their story, to remind the world of the lives that once lit up these waiting halls. Every time I pass near the old station, I sense the lingering echoes of voices and footsteps, a reminder that some places are haunted not by malevolence, but by the unyielding need to be remembered. It was a night that redefined my understanding of loss, duty, and the power of memory. The ghostly encounter at Silver Creek Terminal remains etched into my soul, an undeniable truth that even in death, the bonds of love and responsibility persist. And so I carry with me the weight of that night, forever altered by the gentle yet harrowing plea of a ghostly guardian and the lost souls of a tragic past.
Next story.
I never believed that an abandoned carnival could hide such a dark secret until that fateful night. My name is Daniel, and I'm about to share the truth behind an experience that shattered my perception of the world. It was during the humid summer of 1998 in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, a town that still clings to remnants of its bustling past when the carnival was the highlight of summer nights. I was drawn there by a mixture of morbid curiosity and local legends of a restless spirit, a performer who never left the grounds after a tragic accident years ago. That evening, I arrived at the outskirts of town as twilight bled into the sky. The carnival grounds, long abandoned, lay in eerie silence under a blanket of overgrown weeds and rusting metal. The faded neon signs, once vibrant with promises of joy and wonder, now flickered sporadically like the heartbeat of a dying dream. I remember the distinct smell of damp earth mixed with stale grease and the distant sound of a creaking ride. Every step I took on the cracked concrete pathway stirred up memories of a past that had been violently interrupted. I had heard the stories growing up, whispers among the locals about the ghost of Amelia, a talented aerialist whose life ended abruptly on a misfired safety net during a performance. They said she never truly left. Her laughter and sorrow still echoed among the rusted rides and empty tents. With a mix of skepticism and a desire to uncover the truth, I set out to explore the derelict carnival, determined to document what I might encounter. I made my way past the broken ticket booth and into the main tent, its canvas flapping in the wind like a tattered flag of forgotten dreams. Inside, my flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows of empty seats and a stage that bore the scars of decades of use. Dust motes danced in the weak light, and the silence felt oppressive, as though the air itself mourned what once was. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air, a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature that sent shivers down my spine. While exploring the main tent, I heard a soft melodic hum. It was the most delicate sound I had ever heard, like the distant notes of a music box playing a lullaby. Drawn to the sound, I followed it to a small, secluded area behind the stage. There, in a small alcove near a shattered mirror, I saw her, a figure in a faded costume with sequins that had lost their luster and wings that looked as if they were made of delicate, broken glass. Amelia. Her eyes, once filled with the sparkle of youth and ambition, now glistened with an otherworldly sorrow. For a brief, suspended moment, our eyes met, and I felt as if her gaze was reaching into the very depths of my soul. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat, swallowed by a mixture of awe and terror. She began to float forward, moving with an elegance that defied the decay around her. The soft hum grew louder, a sound that was both inviting and deeply mournful. As she approached, I could see the remnants of her past, a locket hanging from her neck, a faded photograph of smiling faces, and a torn piece of fabric that hinted at happier times. Her presence was not malevolent. It was tragic. Yet, as she glided past me, I felt a weight descend upon my heart, as if I had unwittingly become a witness to her eternal pain. Her silent plea was clear. She was trapped, bound by a history of misfortune and sorrow that had been etched into the very bones of the carnival. I followed her silently, compelled by a mix of empathy and an overwhelming need to understand her story. She led me to an old dressing room tucked away in a corner of the tent. The room was a time capsule of faded glamour, a cracked vanity mirror, old costumes draped over a chair, and a single spotlight that had long since lost its shine. On a dusty table lay a worn diary, its pages yellowed with age. I picked it up, and as I flipped through the entries, the diary revealed a narrative of love, loss, and tragedy. Amelia had been the star of the show, adored by many, yet haunted by the pressures of perfection and the fear of failure. In one final, desperate entry, she recounted the fateful night when everything went wrong, a failed routine, a malfunctioning safety net, and a fall that left her shattered, both physically and spiritually. As I read her final words, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, soft and deliberate, like the measured beats of a heart. The air grew denser, and the temperature plummeted further still. I could hear the distant, sorrowful laughter of a crowd that had once filled these very grounds. The spectral glow of the old spotlight flickered, casting wavering shadows that danced around the room. Then, without warning, the door behind me creaked open. I turned slowly to see a figure emerging from the darkness, a man in a tattered suit, his eyes hollow, and his expression resigned. He introduced himself in a voice that trembled with regret. His name was Charles, and he claimed to be the carnival's former manager. According to him, he had been responsible for ensuring the safety of the performers and had witnessed the night of the accident. Overwhelmed by guilt, he had taken his own life in the very dressing room where Amelia's tragedy had unfolded. Now, his ghost was condemned to wander the carnival grounds, forever bound to the memories of that dreadful evening. Charles's apparition recounted how he had tried to save Amelia that night, his frantic attempts echoing in the corridors of his mind even now. He confessed that the carnival, with all its faded splendor and shattered dreams, was a living mausoleum for lost souls. The spirits of those who had perished there were trapped in a never-ending loop of regret and longing, doomed to reenact their final moments over and over again. As his story unfolded, I felt the full weight of their collective sorrow. The ghostly apparitions of performers and patrons began to appear around me. Fleeting images of laughter turned to tears, of joy turned to horror. The air was thick with the past, each spectral whisper a reminder of lives abruptly ended. It was then that Amelia reappeared, her eyes now filled with a glimmer of hope. She moved toward Charles, and in a moment of ethereal grace, their hands nearly touched. For a brief second, it was as if time stood still, the two souls reaching out to one another across the chasm of despair. But then, as quickly as it had begun, the vision faded. The figures dissolved into nothingness, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence of the dressing room. I clutched the diary tightly, feeling an indescribable mix of sorrow and liberation. I knew I had witnessed something beyond the realm of mortal understanding, a true manifestation of the ghosts that linger in the spaces between memory and oblivion. With trembling resolve, I left the dressing room and made my way back through the carnival grounds. The once vibrant neon signs flickered their final goodbyes, and the rusted rides stood as monuments to a bygone era of dreams and despair. I emerged into the cool night air, my heart heavy with the burden of the stories I had uncovered. I had come seeking proof of the paranormal, and in that forsaken carnival, I had found a truth far more haunting than any legend. Even now, the echoes of that night resonate within me. I share this account not as a work of fiction, but as a testament to the lingering presence of those who have suffered, whose voices have been silenced by the relentless march of time. The abandoned carnival remains a spectral reminder that some tragedies never truly fade. They are etched into the fabric of our history, waiting for the unwary to uncover them.